everyone, AMR back again with another top 5 video for the NFL. So in today's episode, you can base off the title, but it is going to be the top 5 running backs for the upcoming NFL season. As we get closer and closer to our fantasy drafts and the NFL season closely starts to creep up on us, we need to be taking a closer look at why certain players deserve to be picked over one another. These are difference makers in the NFL. So these may not be in order of the most amount of yards that an NFL player will go ahead and finish out the season, but these are going to be the 5 most impactful running backs in my personal opinion. So starting off here, we have James Conner. So in my personal opinion, actions speak way louder than words. And so for this bullet point number 2 right here, we have the team went ahead and got rid of Chase Edmonds this offseason. They saw what they needed out of James Conner last season when Chase Edmonds was out. He actually had a game where he had 4 touchdowns in the absence of Chase Edmonds. This guy is an absolute difference maker for the team. Last season, James Conner finished the season with 18 total touchdowns, 15 on the ground and 3 through the air. That was astronomical compared to what he was projected for the season. He totally outperformed, especially being a backup role at the beginning of the season. It was definitely kind of considered that they were going to share time throughout the season, but as it kind of unfolded, James Conner just seemed to be that workhorse that they really, really needed. Let's go ahead and jump down through this list here. We have at the very top here, a contender in the AFC West, projected for 9.5 wins this season. It's no surprise to anyone that the Arizona Cardinals are going to be one of the better teams in the AFC West. So I had to make a quick edit there actually, but they're actually going to be a contender in the NFC West. Sorry about that. I had AFC originally, but they're projected for 9.5 wins this season. So it should really come to no surprise that the Arizona Cardinals are going to be one of the best people or best teams to come out of that division. And James Conner is going to be a big part of that. If he can even get half of the touchdowns as what he did last season, that'll still be 9. 9 is a lot of touchdowns for a running back to acquire, and he's on a team that will be without DeAndre Hopkins for the first 6 weeks, maybe more, of the season. They went ahead and they got rid of Christian Kirk. He's now on Jacksonville. They went ahead and got Hollywood Brown during the draft. I think that was a very smart decision, having some experience between Kyler Murray and Hollywood Brown. But all things being considered, I definitely think that the Kingsbury type offense is going to end up featuring James Conner more often than not. So as we go down this list, we have number 3 here. Conner was best when Edmonds was out. I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, but in the games that Edmonds actually missed, Conner stepped up. He was playing as 2 running backs essentially. He only had Eno Benjamin behind him, and in the games where he actually didn't have Edmonds, he was a top 12 running back every single week, it seemed like. Next on our list here, we have coming off the healthiest season he's had yet. It's always been a thing with James Conner that an injury is bound to happen with him. Last season, I think he only missed 1 game due to injury, and he was superb. You know, he is a cancer survivor coming out of Pitt, and he's just so prone to being injured. We're so accustomed to that when he was in Pittsburgh, but now that he actually got that role of oh crap, I could actually be a backup if I'm not careful. He stayed healthy this entire season, or last season that is, and he was able to dominate in his role. So second to last bullet point here, we have no true threats in the backfield to go ahead and take his job. So right now, as I mentioned earlier, you have Eno Benjamin. There's no more Chase Edmonds. It's really just going to be the James Conner show. So if he ends up getting hurt, Eno Benjamin's going to be a stellar pickup in your waiver wires. But for the time being, I really think that James Conner is going to be providing the most amount of value for you moving forward. And then lastly, we touched on it a little bit earlier, but he is a pass catching threat as well. 3 of his touchdowns did come through the air last season. And additionally, he actually acquired 375 yards through the air. So 375 and 3 for James Conner through the air is definitely a nice compliment to his overall running game that we all know him for. So next up on this list, we have Austin Ekeler. So this might come to a surprise to a lot of people because Austin Ekeler is not one of those household names, but he's quickly becoming it. So last season, I think that he really took a step in the right direction. He ended up staying healthy. He was on a team that was winning, and he had a nose for the end zone. All of those things definitely go taking into account for the upcoming season, but injuries are something that you have to worry about when you're dealing with Austin Ekeler. Let's go ahead and talk through this list here. So first off, he's in a tough division where scoring and scoring often is going to be an absolute necessity. So being on that Los Angeles Chargers team is definitely going to put him near the top of that division. It's going to be a loaded division. You got Denver, which has now Russell Wilson. You got Vegas, who now has, Davante Adams, Darren Waller, Josh Jacobs, Hunter Renfrow. And then not also to mention the Kansas City Chiefs, who, they don't necessarily have Tyreek Hill, but they did go ahead and get Sky Moore. They got MVS, Travis Kelce, McCole Hardman. It's just going to be an absolute knockdown, drag out type of a division. And scoring is going to be absolutely essential if you want to keep up. So next up here, we have threat on the ground and through the air. So similar story to Ekeler as what we just heard about Connor. Austin Ekeler is absolutely crazy good at catching passes out of the backfield. So a fun statistic is actually that Austin Ekeler only has about 100 more yards rushing than he does receiving in his entire NFL career. You can look that up, and I'll try and have like a little bit of a bullet point right here. But Austin Ekeler on the ground has 2,812 yards, and through the air, he has 2,726 yards. So he is definitely going to be as close to a dual threat as you get in today's age. Last season, similar to what we saw with James Conner, except a little bit further of a exaggeration, we saw 12 touchdowns on the ground and then an additional 8 through the air, making his grand total for 20 touchdowns last season. So he is an absolute threat both in the air and on the ground. Austin Ekeler is going to be that guy for the Los Angeles Chargers. So another thing we really have to talk about is how healthy he was able to stay last season, and that's not something that we're totally accustomed to when we talk about Austin Ekeler. Austin Ekeler tends to be one of those guys that you can almost guarantee is going to miss, 1, 2, 3 games a season. And last season we didn't see it, which was phenomenal. He basically got to play that whole 16 game season because essentially he missed one game last season. So with that in mind, he was able to get over 200 carries last season. That is crazy. That is so many carries per game that he was able to accumulate throughout the entire season, which translated to a plethora of fantasy points. And here we also see the addition of 70 receptions through the air. That's crazy. So he had 270 plus opportunities last season, and it did not go to waste. He had so many yardage. He had so many yards from scrimmage last season that he became one of the most relevant running backs in all of football. And then lastly here, which is probably the most important, is that there's an established chemistry between Justin Herbert and Austin Ekeler that just really cannot go unnoticed. It just seems like whenever you have a young quarterback, if you also have a pass catching running back, then the two kind of go hand in hand. Justin Herbert does all of his reads. If he doesn't get there, then he just dumps it off to Austin Ekeler, and Austin Ekeler does the rest. Austin Ekeler is going to be one of those guys you really have to watch out for, and if he ends up falling to you in the late second round, which is very unlikely, by the way. He's probably going to be like around 6 to 8 picks. You definitely want to nab him as fast as you can. He's going to be one of those guys that's going to make a difference. He could definitely win you so many weeks that you need to go after this guy. So next up on our list, we have Dalvin Cook. So this one kind of hits close to home. If you don't know, I am from Minnesota. And Dalvin Cook is no slouch at the running back position. He actually last season missed a couple of games due to a shoulder injury. Again, he's a running back. I feel like this is just a common thing that we know when we deal with running backs here. But he missed a couple of games last season due to a shoulder injury. He came back and he had like 200 yards rushing. He's an absolute monster in the backfield, and his brother just got drafted. He was from Georgia, and then it's kind of funny because Dalvin Cook was faster than his brother by like 0.01 on the 40-yard dash. They're essentially clones of one another. They look identical. If you haven't got, it's crazy. But looking here at that first bullet point, they're in a weak division, and by weak division, I don't necessarily mean to throw Green Bay under that bus, but you have Chicago, who's doing whatever at the head office. I am a Bears fan, and I really can't understand what they're doing with their decision making. You have Detroit Lions, who are completely rebuilding, and then you have Aaron Rodgers, who don't have Davante Adams anymore, but that doesn't really necessarily mean that you can count Rodgers out by any means. But they are projected for 8.5 wins. I think that this is a team that's going to rely heavily on Dalvin Cook out of the backfield. They have a completely new coaching staff. They fired Mike Zimmer. They went after They went after a completely new staff that would be able to get them into the playoffs and then do something with that playoff once they get there. Minnesota is notorious for making the playoffs and then just blowing it on stupid things. And so I feel like they just have so much talent on the team right now outside of Dalvin Cook that I think that if they don't make the playoffs this season, they really need to start drastically rethinking their head office and everything. So Dalvin Cook was able to stay healthy last season. I did mention that he missed a couple of games, but honestly, he was probably his most explosive that we've ever seen out of him. In that 200-yard rushing game, he was ridiculous. It looked like everyone was just a pace slower than him. He was breaking tackles. He was getting around the edge so lightning quick. And Dalvin Cook is also a pass catching back. He's one of those guys that you cannot count out late in the game. One of the most important parts of Minnesota's offense is that they have weapons outside of Dalvin Cook, which makes Dalvin Cook that much stronger of a threat out of the backfield. When you have a receiver like Justin Jefferson being considered one of the top 5 wide receivers in the NFL, combined with Adam Thielen, who's the sure-handed, third down wide receiver, gives you those quick yards, and then you have the up-and-coming talent of Irv Smith Jr., and then that's not even to mention that you have KJ Osborne, Smith Marset. Like, you have so many different guys that are up and coming in that offense that the sky's the limit, honestly, with this team. And Dalvin Cook is definitely going to be a main reason to whether or not they succeed or they implode on themselves. And then second to last point here, we have a 1-2 punch with Madison. So this is going to be super important with us understanding that Dalvin Cook can actually stay healthy and the team can afford to miss him for a game or two. So unlike most situations, like with Derrick Henry, which we'll see here in a second, there's not a whole lot of depth at the backfield. Alexander Mattison is one of the most premier backups in all of the NFL. It's kind of sad to see him just being a backup role because in games where Dalvin Cook misses, he actually gets like 100 yards on the ground. He is so good, and it allows Dalvin Cook to get that much needed rest that he needs since he ends up getting banged up so easily. And then lastly, which is probably one of the more bigger points that makes Dalvin Cook so special, is that this team wants to run the football. They would love to hand the ball off to Dalvin Cook 20 times a game and then not really have to rely on Kirk Cousins to make a bunch of risky throws to Justin Jefferson downfield. So Dalvin Cook is definitely in a system that plays into his ability, and I think that that's only going to propel him even further into the future. So next up on this list, we did go ahead and allude to it a little bit earlier, but Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry should be no surprise to anyone on this list. Derrick Henry has been the Yeti for so many seasons now. He was a former Alabama standout. This dude absolutely dismantles defenders when they come his direction. He's essentially a linebacker that can run super fast, has extreme strength, and just is able to pull away from defenders. It's so unnatural to see a person of his size just pulling away from guys who are 30 pounds less, that are 30 pounds lighter than him. Watching him do that 99-yard rushing touchdown against Jacksonville actually was pretty wild. And then not to mention the stiff arm that he did on Josh Norman. That was also pretty intense. Let's go ahead and go down this list here. So he has an extended rest period, which is something that we haven't necessarily seen from him just quite yet. He's been relatively healthy, especially for the workload that he's been given. He had that Jones fracture, which happened right around like week 7 or 8. I only know that because he's on my fantasy team. But he has an extended rest period. I think that he got back just a little bit too early to make the playoffs last season, and it really didn't make much of a difference to the team's outcome. I think that they were going to lose that game anyway. Tannehill seems to be having his own little battles with mental. But you get to see Derrick Henry come off an extended rest. He's going to come back stronger than ever, and I really think that we're going to see Derrick Henry's best season yet. So second up here, he's on a team that is a contender in the division. I mean, this team wants to win. They went out and they got some talent at the receiving core. They went ahead and they made sure that Derrick Henry had everything he needed to get that smooth recovery back. And then not to mention that they also have a pretty stellar defense to go with an overpowered offense. So on that third bullet point, they are a run-first team. This team is going to give Derrick Henry so many carries per game. It's going to be 25 plus carries a game, and Derrick Henry usually is pretty efficient on them, averaging right around the 125 all the way up to 200 yards a game on the ground. So It is no surprise that he is the biggest pound for pound running back in the entire NFL. It really is no surprise. Look at the guy. It's almost like if God were to sculpt the perfect running back, Derrick Henry would be that guy. He is fast, he's strong, he has such good agility, he makes good decision making, and he can just be such the bruiser back that a team needs. So right there on bullet point number 5, we have those ceiling games. We've seen it a couple of times in his career where he surpasses that 30 carry mark per game. Incredible. And he's done it, I think, like 4 or 5 times now where he's had over 200 yards rushing in a single game. He's one of like the super talents in the NFL, and it's kind of crazy to me that we don't just give him the MVP every single season. He's doing things that no one else is doing. And then lastly here, he has no competitors out of the backfield. It's really the Derrick Henry show. This team lives and breathes behind Derrick Henry. In the games where Derrick Henry was on the field, they were winning handedly against their opponents. Teams fear Derrick Henry, and for good reason. And then so for our last running back here, we have Jonathan Taylor. So Jonathan Taylor, in my personal opinion, is the best running back in all of football. Now, I don't want to take away anything that we just talked about with Derrick Henry, because I definitely think that Derrick Henry and Jonathan Taylor should be thought of as a 1-2. But before we go ahead and talk too much about Jonathan Taylor, let's kind of like talk about the elephant in the room, or the elephant not in the room, if you will. Christian McCaffrey's not on this list. Christian McCaffrey, in my personal opinion, is probably the best running back in the entire NFL when healthy. He's never healthy. He's on a team that sucks. And it's just way too much risk. There's too much risk involved for where you have to pick him in the NFL draft to actually go after him. It's not worth the roller coaster game that you're going to go with for Christian McCaffrey. It's so much easier to just go ahead and let whoever else deal with that. Get a secure pick, get a Jonathan Taylor, get a Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook, Austin Eckler. There's just so many options right now in the NFL that you can go with outside of just a risk-prone Christian McCaffrey on a team that's really not destined to win too many games this season. So that's that whole issue. But here on Jonathan Taylor, I think that he's going to be the most impactful running back in all of football this season. You have him on a run-heavy team that burns down the clock with him running the football. I mean, last season, how many times did you watch an Indianapolis Colts game? I mean, you might not have at all, but in games where Indianapolis Colts are playing, and then you're like, holy shit, where did the game go? Like, the whole game's gone now, and the score is like 14-0. Yeah, sure, they might not run up the score. Jonathan Taylor gets a ton of opportunities, and most of the time, even though they got 14 points, Jonathan Taylor got those 2 touchdowns. You can almost rest assured. Like, Jonathan Taylor is one of those guys that will put his head down and just plow through people. He's also kind of a speedster. It doesn't seem like it because he got caught from behind in one game, but he actually is pretty damn fast. And he's on a team that's projected to win the AFC South. There's not a whole lot of competition in that division right now, with Houston and Jacksonville both rebuilding. You have the Tennessee Titans, but again, they are solely dependent on Derrick Henry. So if he's able to stay healthy, then that's going to be pretty much their only competitor. And in those games, we definitely saw Indianapolis giving the Titans a run for their money. So that third one, he's finally got a competent veteran quarterback. So for that third bullet point, he's finally got a competent veteran quarterback in Matt Ryan. I think that Carson Wentz did an okay job in Indianapolis, but Matt Ryan is really the answer that they need. It kind of seems like Indianapolis is becoming the place where quarterbacks go to die, but I really hope that Matt Ryan doesn't give us that Phillip Rivers feel this season. I think Matt Ryan's got a lot left in the tank, and he just didn't have a ton of options last season. And his team, like his offensive line, was kind of imploding on itself. Indianapolis Colts have a very good offensive line. They have plenty of like weapons to go around. You got Michael Pittman Jr., Ali Mo Cox. I just think that there's a ton to go around here for Matt Ryan. And Jonathan Taylor could definitely excel in a situation where his team is set up to win games. So he's coming off one of the best seasons by a running back ever. I personally think that if Derrick Henry didn't get injured, that he would have for sure beat Jonathan Taylor in total yardage and touchdowns. But that's like comparing apples to oranges in my personal opinion. You know, Jonathan Taylor had a game where he had like 5 touchdowns last season. It's incredible to watch this guy play. So for that bullet point number 5, he fits perfectly into the offensive scheme. As we talked about earlier, this team wants to run the clock down. Literally, they want to run the clock down, and Jonathan Taylor is the best back to do that. Last season, he averaged 5.5 carries. Last season, he averaged 5.5 yards per carry and 106.5 yards per game. Jonathan Taylor is going to be one of those guys that is going to do a repeat in this season. He is going to be the guy that makes or breaks your team, and he definitely didn't show any signs of being injured at all. This guy was the most dependable back in all of football last season. And whenever I personally went up against someone who had Jonathan Taylor on their team, it's pretty much chalked for that week. And then for that last bottom point here, he's a top 3 running back on pretty much every single platform that does mock drafts. It's been pretty much Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, Derrick Henry, and then you just do a permutation in whatever order that you want to go ahead and you just go ahead and do a combination in any order that you want, ranging from, pick 1 to 3. But Jonathan Taylor is, in my personal opinion, is going to be the difference maker. Some honorable mentions to go ahead and throw out there would be Joe Mixon, Aaron Jones, and Nick Chubb. I think that all 3 of those are also going to be solid options. I think that all of them carry their own risk. Joe Mixon was very good last season because he was able to stay healthy, but injuries have been a thing of the past for Joe Mixon, so be careful with that. Nick Chubb's going through a transition period at quarterback. We don't really know what's going to happen with Deshaun Watson. There's a lot of drama in the locker room right now about whether or not are they going to go into more of a Amari Cooper. They just re-signed Njoku to like a 4-year deal at tight end. He has to split time between Kareem Hunt and himself. Nick Chubb's super talented. I definitely don't worry about him as much, but for him being a top 5 running back this NFL fantasy season, I don't necessarily see that. And then for Aaron Jones, again, there's a lot of question marks in Green Bay right now. How are they going to be able to manage life without Devontae Adams? And as well as MVS, it is what it is, but you also have A.J. Dillon being that super complement. Aaron Jones has also struggled to stay healthy in the past as well. But that's going to do it for this list. So to recap here, so at number 5, we have James Conner. At number 4, we have Austin Eckler. At number 3, we have Dalvin Cook. At number 2, Derrick Henry. And to top it all off, we have Jonathan Taylor. As always, I'll catch you the next one. See ya.